1977. We are into the 10th year of the occupation. There are already 80 Jewish settlements in the West Bank.
My personal motivation and that of the people who came with me was a religious national motivation, which included two commandments. One of them was to rescue the land of Israel from desolation. As you can see around, it's desolate. And the other was to rescue the land of Israel from foreign domination. That means in an area which Israel controls, because of repelling a war of aggression by Jordan and in self-defense, we feel Israel should establish its presence here permanently.
Menachem Begin, the leader of the Israeli right, becomes prime minister. Settlement of the occupied territories is given absolute priority. He will not return a single inch of land of the West Bank, which he refers to by its biblical name of Judea Samaria, or of the Golan, or of Gaza. And yet it is Begin who will give Sinai back to Egypt. The desert forms no part of the Bible's Greater Israel, and Egypt, which has now come into the American sphere of influence, is no longer a danger to Israel. On November the 19th, 1977, a taboo is broken. Sadat becomes the first Arab leader to recognize Israel, the first to address the Knesset, the parliament at Jerusalem. The broad outline of the deal has been set up by US President Jimmy Carter. Carter proposes a peace for land deal with a homeland for the Palestinians. By extending a hand to Golda Meir, to Yitzhak Rabin, and to all the Israelis who acclaim him during his 3 days in Israel, Sadat is gambling with his political career and risking his life. The Arabs will never forgive him his journey unless the American promises are kept. The peace treaty that is finally concluded amounts to no more than a separate deal between Egypt and Israel. And the proposed autonomy for Palestine fails to materialize. Egypt is thrown out of the Arab League and Sadat is assassinated in 1981. Beirut and Lebanon have succumbed to civil war, a conflict that is to last for 15 years. Catalyzed by the Palestinian presence, the war will draw in all the powers in the region. Foremost among these, Syrian leader Hafez al-Assad, a key player with no scruples about changing alliances as and when the situation requires it. In Beirut, there are rival leaders. Pierre Gemayel is a Maronite feudal lord and leader of the right-wing Phalange party who bitterly opposes the Palestinians in Lebanon and is discreetly supported by Israel. And Kamal Jumblat, the left-wing head of the Druze community. He finds Arafat a natural ally, and each supports the other. Onto this battlefield comes a new player, Begin, who in 1978 decides to intervene in Lebanon.
Just a moment. Do I have the right to make an opening statement? And then I'll answer all your questions, except those which I will not answer. I had a very serious talk with the Secretary General of the United Nations. The first topic I brought to him is the situation in southern Lebanon. I brought to his knowledge this map. This is the Litani River. And this is our northern border. And the red color means a Muslim village or township. The blue color, a Christian village or township. The green color, a Druze village or township. And now everybody can see that the Christian villages are an island surrounded by a sea, by an ocean of Muslim and villages and townships. They are all completely outnumbered. Now in this area there are 5,000 members of the so-called PLO, all of them armed with Soviet arms and with Soviet artillery. And from all those Muslim villages there comes every night a barrage of artillery and mortar fire on these single Christian villages. We helped them. Were it not for our help, they would have been wiped out. Nobody else does help them.
In March 1978, the Israeli army invades South Lebanon as far as the Litani River. There are 900 dead, 3,000 injured, and tens of thousands made homeless among the Lebanese and Palestinian civilian population. The United Nations intervenes and Israel withdraws, keeping control of a buffer zone to the north of its own frontier, a further occupied territory. In July 1980, Jerusalem is decreed Israel's eternal capital. The Arab sector of the city is now annexed. The Golan is next to be annexed in December 1981. April 1982. In accordance with the peace agreement with Egypt, Sinai is handed back. Israeli settlers resist bitterly and have to be forced out. Calm prevails during the early months of the year. However, another war is being prepared, a face-off between Israel and the PLO. Civil war has torn the city into two. The east is held by the Christian Phalange, Israel's allies in Lebanon. In the western, mainly Muslim sector, lie the refugee camps of Sabra, Shatila, and Borj al-Barajni, as does Fakani, where the PLO headquarters are located. On June the 6th, 1982, exactly 15 years after the Six Days War, the Israelis enter Lebanon again. This time they push on to the north, destroying bases, combing the towns, leaving hundreds of dead. Thousands of Palestinians are rounded up and placed in camps. Within a week, they have encircled West Beirut. For the first time, Israel is at the gates of an Arab capital. And the siege begins, a siege that will last 88 days. Ariel Sharon, the defense minister, is in eastern Beirut. He is putting into effect a plan drawn up 2 years earlier. The goal is to set up a Phalangist regime in Lebanon and eliminate the PLO once and for all. In full view of the television cameras, West Beirut and its 500,000 inhabitants come under a hail of bombs. Sharon uses fragmentation bombs that continue exploding after their initial impact. Missiles that blow out entire buildings, on some days napalm and phosphorus bombs. On the refugee camps, the city center, the seafront, no district is spared.
Now, ladies and gentlemen, so we didn't enter Beirut, and we hesitated. Yes, indeed, I'm not ashamed to admit hesitations. It's human. But we will have to take care that all the terrorists leave Beirut and Lebanon. None of them will be left, I can assure you. None of them.
Arafat escapes death daily, but around him the casualties are numbered in thousands. He accepts the American proposals, the departure of the PLO in exchange for the lifting of the siege and the protection of the Palestinian civilian population by an international force. 14,000 Fedayeen head into exile, with orange blossom water and Kalashnikovs. Many of them were born in Lebanon. They are leaving their families, whom the Western powers have promised to protect. and they are mourning a second homeland, another lost home. They are dispersed around North Africa, Yemen, Sudan, and Iraq, further, ever further from Palestine. But once again, American promises prove worthless. Sharon's army enters Beirut West. Israeli tanks take up position in front of the PLO offices. Sabra and Shatila, 3,000 women, children, and old people, hacked to death by axe or knife, or shot by the phalangists. The Israeli army was there, standing by. It saw everything and let it happen. These images swept around the world. In Tel Aviv, 400,000 demonstrators, 1/10 of the Israeli population. Against Sharon, against Begin, against this war and these deaths. For the first time, Israel is riven by doubt and remorse. It marks the birth of a massive pacifist campaign which forces Begin to resign. But his successor, Yitzhak Shamir, keeps the Israeli army in Lebanon for another 3 years. He sees the war as a success despite a growing radical opposition. In 1983, Arafat holds talks with Israelis in Tunis. This photograph shows the first dialogue. With Yuri Avneri, a former member of parliament, now the editor of an important weekly publication, and with General Mati Paled, hero of the 6 Days War, who has lost faith in war.
זה לא מפריע לך להיפגש עם יאסר ערפאת דווקא בימים כאלה כשמתבצעים פיגועים בישראל מטעם אש"ף?
אני חושב להפך, המצב הנוכחי שהוא חמור מאוד וכרוך בהרבה מאוד קורבנות קשים לשני הצדדים מחייב לשנס את המותניים ולנסות ולהביא סוף למתיחות הזאת בכל דרך אפשרית, ודווקא המתיחות הקיימת היא שעושה את השליחות שלנו לכל כך דחופה וכל כך חשובה.
They are roundly abused. In 1986, the Knesset passes a law banning dialogue between Israelis and members of the PLO, but Palestinians who meet with Israelis risk death. Issam Sartawi, killed in Lisbon in April 1983. Saeed Hamami, PLO representative in London, killed in December 1978. Azedine Kalak, PLO representative in Paris, killed in August 1978. Naim Kader, PLO representative in Brussels, killed in June 1981. Palestinians murdered by another Palestinian, Abu Nidal, a shadowy figure said to be a tool of Iraq, Syria, or Libya, or some say Israel. In 1987, the Israeli occupation has lasted for almost 20 years. Here in the Gaza refugee camps, hundreds of thousands of Palestinians have been living in growing squalor. On the West Bank, Palestinian workers are building the Jewish settlements. 250,000 Jewish settlers have already set up a cluster of new towns, occupying over 40% of the land. Another fait accompli, making a return of the land increasingly unlikely. They leave Gaza before daybreak and have to undergo lengthy identity checks and body searches. They have no social security and receive half the salary of a Jewish worker. A bus takes them at dawn to their work sites. In the evening, they undergo the same humiliations.
الآن إحنا بنقول للعالم كلها رسالة واحدة SOS بالإنجليزي الحقونا وإلا فقدتمونا. الحقونا وإلا فقدتمونا لأنه الآن إحنا في حالة أصبحنا تحت الصفر. لا لانه اذا انا ما اشتغلتش اولادي كلهم بيموتوا من الجوع.
Gaza, December 87. The war of the stones begins in the occupied territories. Stones against rifles. This is the Intifada, or uprising, a clash between the occupiers and the occupied in the very land of Palestine. They have been waiting for 20 years to be liberated by their brothers outside the land, by the Arabs who failed to move when Beirut was burning, by the PLO, too far away and now too weak. They have nothing to lose, and so they attempt to put an end to the occupation. They themselves take up the torch. They raise their flag and burn that of Israel. They are the same age, they have grown up on the same land. In front of TV cameras, one people is repressing another. Every day the shopkeepers close down at 12 noon. A clandestine general staff issues instructions. No more taxes are to be paid to the occupiers. Collaborators with Israel will be killed. Instructions are faxed between Tunis and the occupied territories. Thousands of copies are placed at night outside front doors. Abu Jihad in Tunis is in charge of contacts within the occupied territories. He's held to be the commander-in-chief of the Intifada and is killed by an Israeli commando. But the uprising continues. In Algiers, the PLO proclaimed the independence of the state of Palestine. In the occupied territories, despite the presence of the Israeli army, they feel that they are already free. And the women sew flags for an imaginary state on this real territory. In each of his public statements, Arafat addresses the Israelis. Day by day, he speaks the words they are waiting for.
The PLO parliament, the Palestinian parliament, the PNC had accepted two states, Palestine state and Jewish state, between brackets, Israel. I repeat for the record that we totally and absolutely renounce all forms of terrorism. All forms of terrorism, including individual, group, and state terrorism. We want peace. We are committed to peace. We are committed to peace. We want to live in our Palestinian state. We want to live in our Palestinian state and let live. And let live. Thank you.
In his Geneva speech, Arafat did not announce that he recognizes Israel's right to exist. He ostensibly renounced terror, but at the same time hailed what he calls a struggle of liberation. We shall not negotiate with the PLO under any conditions, nor recognize it. From our point of view, the PLO is no partner for any peace process. It is a terrorist organization aimed at undermining our national existence and bringing about the destruction of the state of Israel.
40 years of mutual rejection cannot be wiped out at the throw of a stone. From now on, rejection is in Israel's camp. Shamir spurns the hand extended by Arafat. Like him, the majority of Israelis are still afraid to believe in peace. but henceforth the discussion continues in the street.
אנשים באים אליי ואומרים לי, הקיבוצים שלכם נמצאים על אדמות ערביות. בוודאי. בטח שהקיבוצים שלנו נמצאים על ערביות. אין יישוב בארץ שלא נמצא. תשחרר אותם, עזוב אותם, תן להם אותם חזרה. לא, מה שאני אומר זה, אנחנו טוענים שכל ארץ ישראל שייכת לנו, הם טוענים שכל ארץ ישראל שייכת להם. בואו נהיה אנשים בוגרים ונעשה חצי-חצי.
לא רצו, הם התנגדו. היה חצי-חצי. עכשיו שהפסידו, שיחזירו לנו את הבחורים שמתו.
הרגע שהם יעזבו את הטרור ויכירו במדינת ישראל.
אבל אתה אמרת איזה ערבות יש לך שהם יעזבו את הטרור? איזה ביטחון? הם יבואו ויגידו לך יעזבתי את הטרור הזה או עזבו?
אני רואה דבר כזה. ההסכמים האלה הם לא יקחו חודש, חודשיים, מה-1 בנובמבר, ב-10 בנובמבר כבר יהיה שלום. כן, זה ייקח לפחות 3-4 שנים כל הדבר הזה. הם רואים שהם לא עומדים בהסכם שלהם, אנחנו לא צריכים לעמוד בהסכם שלנו.
למי לתת? הם באים, הולכים, גמרנים ילכו מכאן, היו רומאים, היו ביזנטים, היו 12 אימפריות גדולות היו רק, חוץ מקטנים, וכולם אני צריך לתת בית שלי, זה היה להם כוח, ג'יהאד, ספרד, אתה לא רוצה לתת לערבים?
מה ששמעת בתעמולה
שומרון? מה הם שומרון?
שומרון יש שם רק ערבים.
מה אכפת לי, ופה לא היו ערבים, לפני 100 שנה גם פה לא היו יהודים, גם פה לא היו יהודים.
הנה המסגד שלהם, הנה המסגד שלהם.
This scene, broadcast around the world, shows that the Israeli army has received orders to break the bones, arms or hands of the stone throwers, to only hurt them, reducing both the number of deaths and international criticism. There will still be hundreds of deaths and hundreds of thousands of injured.
אתם משחיתים את נפש הנוער שלנו, שעה שאתם משלחים אותם מול נשים וילדים. 18 שנה במערכת החינוך שלנו הם לומדים את הכרזת העצמאות. הם לומדים על הושטת יד לשלום. הם מדברים על פיתוח הארץ לטובת כל תושביה. הם מדברים על שוויון האדם ואי אפליה. בהגיעם לגיל 18, אנשים בוגרים ומבוגרים, אתם משלחים אותם לפי חוקים קולוניאליים, ששר החוץ שלנו קורא להם חוקים ירדנים. אזרחי ישראל, ילדי ישראל, בשליחות ממשלת ישראל, לפי חוקים קולוניאליים, לעשות את הבלתי נכון, לא רק מבחינה מוסרית, אלא לפי כל כלל של חוק צדק בסדר.
Only a dozen out of Israel's 120 MPs speak this way. Elsewhere, the Cold War has come to an end, but here in the occupied territories, repression continues. In Kuwait, UN resolutions have implemented the use of force, but here, the Palestinians have been waiting for 23 years of occupation. The New World Order, according to James Baker, the US Secretary of State. He has a peace plan for the Middle East. Palestinian delegates from the entire diaspora must give an answer to the American proposals, negotiate the future of the occupied territories under conditions which many of them see as unacceptable. For example, George Abash, Arafat's oldest political adversary.
أطفال الحجارة الذين كثيرا ما خاطبتهم من منفاك يا أخي العزيز يريدون علما ونشيدا وطنيا وجواز سفر ومقعدا في هيئة الأمم وأرضا يستندون لها لتحقيق كل أهدافهم الوطنية، أي تحرير كامل التراب الوطني الفلسطيني لا يريدون حكما ذاتيا. الثورة الفلسطينية المعاصرة لم تقدم حوالي 75 ألف شهيد من أجل حكما ذاتيا.
The PLO is not officially invited to the negotiations. The US plan does not envisage immediate talks on the return of the refugees. However, the interim status proposed for the occupied territories could be a first step towards independence. This is Arafat's hardest fight. He knows it is the last chance to obtain a better life for his people. But he's lonely. His longtime companion Abu Iyad has just been murdered by Abu Nidal. 256 in favor, 68 against. 12 abstain. Rejection is rejected. The PLO will negotiate. George Bush and Mikhail Gorbachev jointly open the Madrid Peace Conference. For the first time, all Israel's neighbors are present for the talks. Syria, Jordan, and Lebanon have sent their foreign ministers. Shamir has come in person to better defend the Israeli position. He will refuse all concessions and threatens to walk out if the name of the PLO is so much as mentioned. One man is missing at this table, but Palestine is present, represented by Haidar Abdel Shafi, a militant from the occupied territories. He has been mandated by the PLO, though he's not to say so. He will be allowed as much speaking time as the other delegates and be accorded the same honors. But after the talks, he will go home to Gaza, still under occupation. James Baker arrives. Pax Americana. It was October the 30th, 1991. More than a year has passed and they are still talking. Meanwhile, blood continues to flow daily and the land devours its victims. A frail hope gleams. Those who are fighting on this land and for it are still waiting for the resolution of its destiny through law, justice, and history.
That was the final episode in this series. Next week, a documentary made to mark the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Human Rights. Article 1, Defending Human Rights, 12:30 next Friday.